I was unconscious in the hospital for 11 hours. No one from the family came. Not my mother-in-law, who I had nursed through 2 surgeries with my own hands. Not my brother-in-law, whose children I had raised like my own for 5 of the 12 years I had lived in that house. Not one person from the family that had been, for over a decade, the only family I had. And while I lay there, in a hospital bed, alone, not knowing where I was or what had happened, they were at the sub-registrar's office, with documents, with my husband's name, transferring the house he had left me to themselves in 11 hours, while I couldn't speak and couldn't stop them and didn't even know it was happening. When I found out, I didn't cry. I had cried enough by then. I just sat very quietly in that hospital room, and I thought about a conversation my husband Arjun had with me about 8 months before he died. He had said, very calmly, very deliberately, the way he said the things that mattered most. "Meera, whatever happens, you will be taken care of. I've made sure of it. There is someone who has something for you, and he knows exactly when to use it." I hadn't fully understood what he meant then. I understood it the day his best friend walked into the courtroom with a sealed envelope. This is everything that happened, from the beginning. My name is Meera, and I came into this family 23 years old, newly married, and entirely optimistic. I had grown up in a modest household in a smaller city, the second of 3 daughters, in a family where there was always enough, but never comfortably more than that. My parents were practical, warm, and honest people who had raised all 3 of us to believe that hard work and reliability were the most durable forms of self-respect. I carried those beliefs into my marriage with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which I carried everything else. Arjun was 30 when we married. He ran a small but steady electrical goods trading business that his father had started and that he had taken over and gradually expanded. He was a quiet person, not distant, not cold, but constitutionally reserved in the way that some people simply are, as though they have decided at some early point that they will express themselves through action rather than declaration. He was good to me from the first week. He was fair and consistent, and I trusted him in the uncomplicated way you trust someone who has never given you a reason not to. The family I married into was larger and louder than the one I had come from. Arjun's mother, Sudha, was a woman of strong opinions and stronger habits, who had run the household for 30 years with an authority she had no intention of sharing or diminishing simply because a daughter-in-law had arrived. I understood this quickly, and I adapted to it. I didn't think of adaptation as surrender. I thought of it as the ordinary work of belonging somewhere new. Arjun's younger brother, Deepak, lived in the same house with his wife, Rekha, and their 2 young children. Deepak worked intermittently, a series of jobs that never lasted more than a year, each one abandoned for reasons that were always someone else's fault. Rekha managed the children and spent a considerable amount of energy managing Deepak's relationship with his mother and elder brother. She was not unkind exactly, but she was watchful in the particular way of someone who is always calculating what she might need in the future. I learned the house. I learned the rhythms of it, who needed tea at what time, which supplier called on which day, how Sudha preferred her evening meal arranged, what Deepak's moods signaled about the atmosphere for the rest of the day. I managed the household accounts when Arjun was occupied with the business. I sat with his father through the long, slow decline of his last years, reading to him when he could no longer read himself, keeping him company on the afternoons when the rest of the house was occupied elsewhere. When he died, I was the one who organized the practical aftermath, the paperwork, the relatives, the arrangements. Because Arjun was in the grip of a grief that left him briefly non-functional, and the rest of the house was not interested in the logistical work. I did all of this, not because I was unaware that it was a great deal, or because I was the kind of person who doesn't notice when effort goes unacknowledged. I did it because I had married into this family, and I took that seriously, and because Arjun was worth it, and because I believed, in the earnest and perhaps slightly naive way that I believed most things in those early years, that effort compounds over time and eventually becomes visible to the people who benefit from it. Some of those years were good ones, in the ordinary, uncelebrated way that most of life is good. Not dramatic, not abundant, but stable and sufficient and occasionally warm. Arjun and I were happy together in the private way that people who understand each other tend to be. He knew, without my saying it, when I was tired or discouraged. I knew, without his saying it, when the business was worrying him or when his mother had said something that had settled heavily on him. We communicated in the abbreviated language of people who have lived closely together long enough to have developed their own shorthand. He got sick when he was 41. It was not the kind of illness that announces itself clearly. It arrived as fatigue. Then as a persistent low-level unwell feeling that he dismissed for months in the way that men of his generation and temperament tend to dismiss such things. By the time he allowed himself to be taken to a proper specialist, the diagnosis was significant enough that the doctor spoke to both of us together, with the particular careful gravity that doctors deploy when they want to make sure the patient is not alone in the room with difficult information. Arjun was calm. He was calm in the doctor's office, and he was calm in the car on the way home, and he was calm that evening when he sat down with me in our room with the door closed and talked through what the next months would involve. He was practical and clear and organized about it in a way that I recognized as his particular form of courage. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that simply continues to function. He lived for 14 months after the diagnosis. Those 14 months were the hardest of my life, and also, in ways I still find difficult to fully articulate, some of the most clarifying. I understood things about him in that time, about his priorities, about the precision of his affections. That 12 years of ordinary life had not made equally visible. He talked more, in those months, than he had in all the years before them combined. Not about illness, not about the logistical practicalities of what would happen after. Those he handled separately, quietly, with a thoroughness I did not fully appreciate until later. He talked about other things, about his father, about what he had hoped the business would become, about the city where he had grown up, about small specific memories that he seemed to want to give to me for safekeeping, as though he knew I would carry them carefully. 8 months before he died, he said something to me that I have thought about many times since. We were sitting together after dinner, the house quiet around us. He said, without any particular preamble, "Meera, I need you to know something, whatever happens. And I know what is going to happen, and I am at peace with it. So please don't tell me not to say that. You will be taken care of. I have done what needed to be done. There is someone who has something for you, and he knows when to use it. You don't need to ask about this or worry about it. Just remember that I said it. I asked him what he meant." He said, simply, "You'll understand when the time comes." And then he changed the subject, with a decisiveness that told me he had said exactly as much as he had intended to say and would not be adding to it. I thought about it afterward. I wondered if he was talking about some insurance arrangement, or a savings account I didn't know about, or some practical financial matter he had organized and didn't want to discuss in detail. I didn't push him. He had his reasons for telling me what he told me and not more, and I respected that the way I respected most things about him. He died on a Tuesday morning in March. Quietly, as he had lived, I was with him. The rest of the family came in afterward. The weeks that followed the funeral were the first time I understood, with real clarity, the difference between belonging to a family and being tolerated by one. Sadaji's manner toward me changed within days. It was not dramatic. She was too controlled a person for drama. It was a gradual withdrawal of the ordinary courtesies, a reorientation of the household's daily functioning that subtly and consistently communicated that my role in it had shifted. Deepak and Rekha were more straightforward about it. Rekha began making comments. Small ones, easily deniable, the kind that accumulate rather than announce themselves. About how the household expenses were distributed, about how the house itself would be managed going forward, about how things would need to be sorted out properly now that the circumstances had changed. I understood what they were moving toward. I would have been unintelligent not to. But I had no immediate defensive action available to me. The house was in Arjun's name. His will, so far as I knew, had not been formally established. We had talked about it during his illness, but he had been characteristically inexplicit about the details, saying only that everything was arranged and that I should not worry. I had taken him at his word. I had continued to take him at his word, and somewhere in the background, without my knowing, the family was taking steps. The collapse happened about 6 weeks after Arjun died. I had been running on almost nothing for months. The sustained physical and emotional effort of his illness, the funeral, the grief, and the ongoing work of simply functioning in a household where the atmosphere had become quietly hostile. One evening, I simply fell. Dehydration, exhaustion, a blood pressure drop. Nothing that was in itself life-threatening, but enough to send me to the hospital in an ambulance, unconscious, while a neighbor who happened to be home called for help. I was in the hospital for 3 days. In the first 11 hours, I was not fully conscious. No one from the family came in those 3 days. Not once. The neighbor who had called the ambulance, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. D'Souza, who had lived in the building for 20 years, was the person who sat with me until I woke up. She was the person who brought me water and asked the nurses questions and made sure I had eaten something by the second evening. She was a stranger, by the technical definition of the word, and she was more present in those 3 days than the family I had served for 12 years. When I came home from the hospital, I found that my room had been reorganized in my absence. Subtle things. A few items moved, a cupboard that had been mine now containing things that weren't mine. Small, legible messages about how the space was being reimagined. And then, 4 days after I returned home, Deepak sat down with me at the kitchen table and explained, in a tone of careful neutrality, that the house registration had been updated during my hospitalization. That given the complexity of the situation following his brother's death, the family had decided it was most practical for the property to be consolidated in names that reflected the current household arrangement. That he was sure I would understand, given that I had no income, no family of my own nearby, and no particular legal claim that could complicate things. He said all of this calmly. He finished his tea while he said it. He did not look at me as though he expected any particular response. I sat there for a long time after he left the kitchen. Then I got up, went to my room, and sat on the edge of the bed and thought. With unusual clarity for someone who had just been told she had been systematically removed from the home she had lived in for 12 years. About what Arjun had said to me 8 months before he died. There is someone who has something for you, and he knows when to use it. If you've been listening to Meera's story and something in it is pulling at you, if you've ever known what it feels like to give everything and watch it be taken as though it never counted, please do something for me right now, like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment and tell me, 1 word, 2 words, however much you want to write, about a time when someone who should have been there for you simply wasn't. Every comment on this channel is read. Every single one. Now let me tell you what happened next, because this is where the story turns. His name was Shirsh, and he had been Arjun's closest friend since they were 19 years old. I had known Shirsh throughout my marriage. He had attended our wedding, had been present at various family occasions over the years, had the kind of long, quietly established friendship with Arjun that doesn't require frequent demonstration to remain solid. He was a civil engineer who had built a practice in the city over 30 years. He was precise, careful, and not given to unnecessary expression. He and Arjun had been, in many ways, alike. I called him 3 days after the conversation with Deepak. I wasn't entirely sure why I called him specifically, except that he was the person Arjun had trusted most outside the immediate family, and I had nothing else to follow. When I told him what had happened, the hospitalization, the property transfer, the conversation with Deepak, there was a silence on the other end of the phone that lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then he said, "Meera, I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning. Please bring whatever identification documents you have with you. And please don't discuss any of this with anyone in the house before you come." His voice, when he said it, had the particular quality of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation for a specific amount of time and has now received the signal that the time has arrived. I went to his office the next morning. He closed the door. He sat across from me. He placed a sealed envelope on the desk between us. On the front, in Arjun's handwriting, a single word, Meera. He said, "Arjun gave me this 9 months before he died. He told me to keep it safe and to give it to you if you ever called me and told me something had gone wrong." He was very specific, he said. And I'm going to tell you exactly what he said. If Meera calls you and the situation sounds the way I think it might sound, she needs that envelope and she needs a good lawyer. You know which lawyer. Please make the call. Shirsh had already made the call. The lawyer. A woman named Advocate Nalini Sharma, who had practiced property and family law for 28 years and who spoke, I would discover, with the efficient certainty of someone who has seen every possible variation of this kind of situation and is never surprised, was in the next room. I opened the envelope with Arjun's handwriting on it, and my hands were not entirely steady. Inside, a registered will, properly executed and witnessed, dated 9 months before Arjun's death. 2 witnesses, both independent, notarized. Registered at the sub-registrar's office. A copy had been filed with the office, and a copy was in this envelope, and a 3rd copy was in a sealed deposit with the lawyer. In it, Arjun had specified, with the precision and thoroughness that had characterized everything he did, that the house, the property on which the family home stood, registered in his name, was to pass entirely and without condition to his wife, Meera. He had named the property with its full registration details. He had stated, in plain and legally binding language, that no other party had any claim to it, and that any attempt to transfer or reassign the property after his death without the production of this will would be legally void. He had known. Not that it would happen, certainly, but that it might. He had known the family well enough to know what was possible, and he had been thorough enough and loving enough to make sure that what was possible could not ultimately succeed. Advocate Nalini Sharma, when she came into the room and sat down and reviewed the documents, said simply, "The property transfer that was executed during your hospitalization is invalid. It was done without knowledge of the existing registered will, which takes legal precedence. We will file to have it reversed. Given what we have here, the process should be straightforward, though it will take time and Deepak's family will almost certainly attempt to challenge it." I said, "Let them." The legal process took 4 months. Deepak hired a lawyer. Rika's family got involved. Sadaji gave a statement saying that Arjun's mental state at the time he had made the will had been affected by his illness. A claim that Advocate Sharma addressed with documentary evidence from Arjun's medical records, which showed clearly that at the time the will was executed, 9 months before his death, he had been mentally competent and had, in fact, been in a period of relative stability. The 2 witnesses to the will, a retired school teacher and a bank officer, neither of whom had any connection to the family, provided clear and consistent testimony about the circumstances of the signing. There was a court date. There was a proceeding. Deepak and Rekha came with their lawyer. Sadaji was there, accompanied by a distant relative who had been recruited to look supportive. And Suresh walked in with the original registered will, the notarized copies, and a file of supporting documents organized with an engineer's methodical thoroughness. I watched Deepak's face when Advocate Sharma laid the documents before the judge and walked through their contents. I watched the moment when he understood, when it became clear to him that Arjun had not simply left a letter or an informal note or something that could be contested on ambiguous grounds. He had left a registered, witnessed, notarized, filed legal document, the kind that does not yield to family pressure or strategic confusion or the argument that things had been different between brothers. Deepak's face went through several things in a short space of time. It went through denial, the automatic rejection of information that is inconvenient. Then it went through calculation, the rapid, visible assessment of whether there was still an angle, still a maneuver available. Then it went through something that I can only describe as a kind of collapse. Not dramatic, not loud, but the particular collapse of someone who has been carrying a constructed narrative and has just watched it dismantle itself in front of a judge. Rekha, beside him, was very still. Sadaji had her hands in her lap and was looking at a point on the floor somewhere to the left of where the proceedings were happening. She looked, for the first time in the 12 years I had known her, genuinely old. The judge's ruling, when it came, was clear and unreserved. The will was valid. The property transfer executed during my hospitalization was null and void. The property would revert to my name as the sole beneficiary specified in the registered will of Arjun's estate. Legal costs were to be borne by the challenging party. Nobody said anything for a long moment after the ruling was read. Then Advocate Sharma closed her file with the specific quiet satisfaction of someone who has done exactly what she set out to do, and turned to me and said, "We're done here." I moved back into the house 3 weeks later. Deepak, Rekha, and their children had, by then, moved out. To Rekha's parents' home on the other side of the city, I was told by the neighbor who still tracked these things. Sadaji stayed for another 2 months, and then she went to live with a relative in another city. She and I did not speak during those 2 months. Not in anger, not in reconciliation, simply not at all. There was nothing left to say that would have been honest and also bearable, and I did not want to say anything that was neither. I want to tell you something about being in that house alone, the first few evenings, after 12 years of it being full of other people. It was quieter than I had expected. Not peaceful, exactly. Not at first. It was the kind of quiet that has an adjustment period, where the absence of noise that had been constant registers as its own kind of presence. I moved through the rooms, and the rooms were simply rooms. The kitchen was a kitchen. The corridor was a corridor. The spaces that had accumulated 12 years of other people's energy and habit and need were now just spaces, waiting to become whatever I made of them. I put Arjun's photograph on the mantle in the sitting room, not to look at it. I carry his face without needing it in front of me, but as a kind of acknowledgement. He had kept his promise. In the most careful and private and precise way he could have chosen, he had made sure of it. I have thought about that a great deal since then. About what it must have been like for him to do what he did, to see, clearly and without self-deception, what was possible within his own family, and to respond not with confrontation or resentment or the kind of wounded declaration that achieves little except momentary relief. To respond instead with the quiet, methodical work of ensuring that something solid and real would still be standing long after the confrontation would have been forgotten. He had trusted Suresh. He had trusted the law. He had trusted me to make the call when the time came. All 3 trusts held. Suresh came for tea on a Sunday about a month after I moved back in. We sat in the same sitting room where Arjun's photograph now stood, and we drank tea, and we talked about Arjun the way you talk about someone you both loved who is gone, with the particular combination of missing them and being grateful to have known them that doesn't resolve into either emotion cleanly but lives as both simultaneously. Suresh said, toward the end of the afternoon, he spent a long time on that will, you know. He wanted to be certain it was the kind of thing that couldn't be undone. He asked me 3 questions when we sat down to plan it. The first was what the most legally airtight format would be. The second was which lawyer would handle it best. The third was whether I thought you would be all right, not with the house, but generally. Whether I thought you were the kind of person who would still be standing after this. I asked him what he had said. He said, I told him yes, without any hesitation. I still think about that. About Arjun asking the question. About the fact that he needed to know the answer before he could be at peace with what was coming. About what it means to have someone think of you that carefully, that specifically, at the point in their life when they had every reason to be thinking only of themselves. I didn't do anything dramatic with the house. I didn't sell it or renovate it beyond what it needed or mark it with any particular gesture of reclamation. I live in it. I have repainted 2 rooms in colors I chose myself without asking anyone's opinion. I have organized the kitchen the way I actually prefer it, which is different from how it was organized for 12 years to suit other people's preferences. I have plants on the balcony that I chose myself and that I water in the mornings before I start work. These are small things. They are also not small at all. I started working again. The editing work I had let diminish during Arjun's illness, which I have since rebuilt carefully and which now generates a steady and sufficient income. I am not comfortable in the way that makes you stop thinking about money, but I am stable. And stable is what I needed to be. I speak occasionally with Mrs. D'Souza, my neighbor who sat with me in the hospital while no one else did. She is 81 now and still lives in the building and still keeps track of everything that happens in it. She never mentions the events of that period directly, but she has a way of looking at me when we pass in the corridor that communicates something clearly and kindly, and I appreciate it every time. I do not communicate with Deepak or Rekha. I have not seen Sudhaji since she left. I do not know if this absence will be permanent or if at some point one of us will decide to attempt something toward the other. I hold that question open without urgency. There is no bitterness left. Bitterness is expensive, and I have spent enough energy on this family without paying that additional cost. What I have, instead, is something I would not have used that word for a year ago, and which I am using it for now with full awareness of what it means: clarity. About who showed up and who didn't. About what belonging actually requires as opposed to what it is sometimes claimed to require. About the difference between the family you are given and the family that actually acts like one. Arjun showed up. In a sealed envelope, in a lawyer's office, in the testimony of his oldest friend in a courtroom. He showed up. He had been gone for over a year by then, but the thoughtfulness and care with which he had prepared for this outcome was as present in that courtroom as anything I had ever experienced from a living person. That is the thing I carry from this. Not the house, though the house is real and mine and I am glad to have it. Not the legal outcome, though the legal outcome was right and I would not have wanted it to be otherwise. What I carry is the knowledge that someone thought of me specifically and carefully and with full awareness of what I might need at a time when he was also thinking about everything else. About his illness, about his death, about all the things he was losing and leaving. He thought of me. He made sure. He trusted the right people and put the right things in place and told me just enough to know that I should trust it too. That was his last promise. It was the most complete one he ever made. If Meera's story reached you, you already understand what this channel is about. It's not about revenge in the loud sense. It's not about confrontation or drama for its own sake. It's about this, the quiet, careful love of someone who thought ahead, who looked at the people around them and saw, clearly, without resentment, what might happen. And then, instead of warning or accusing or making it someone else's problem, simply prepared. Arjun didn't fight anyone. He just made sure. That kind of love is the rarest kind and the most durable. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that a last promise can still hold, even after the person who made it is gone. Until next time, the truth, as always, arrives exactly when it is supposed to. I was unconscious in the hospital for 11 hours. No one from the family came. Not my mother-in-law, who I had nursed through 2 surgeries